What is up, everyone? We are back with a great film again, and today's movie starts with an interviewer questioning Thomas Harbour, the man who scientifically proved the existence of an afterlife. You see, Thomas proved that consciousness is its own entity, and it leaves the body when the body dies. No one knows where the consciousness goes, but knowing this information has led a lot of people to take their lives, aspiring for a better life, thinking that the existence of an afterlife is much better than living on Earth. The interviewer asks Harbour if he feels responsible for all these deaths, and Thomas responds by saying no. And just as they are wrapping up the interview, one of the cameramen comes before Thomas and thanks him for his discovery and kills himself right in front of everyone. In the next scene, we are taken to 2 years later, and more than 4 million people have also taken their lives, and Thomas has not been seen since that interview, and we're introduced to Thomas's son Will, who is traveling on a ferry. There's only another person on the ferry who's a woman named Isla. They start talking about the discovery, and Will notes that Isla looks familiar. Will tells her that he's upset that people keep killing themselves because nobody actually knows where they're going, but Isla thinks that it's an easy way out, and she believes that going to the afterlife is better than suffering on Earth. During their argument, Will shares a memory that he had of being dead for a minute, and he remembers seeing a beach. And since he's a neuroscientist, he believes that what he saw was his consciousness creating a dream to make sense of things and not the actual afterlife. After an unproductive but playful argument, they reach their destination, and Will is picked up by his brother Toby, who takes him to their father's new estate where he has built up his new station. Will notes people wearing multiple colored jumpsuits, and Toby explains that there are people who fail to take their own lives, and Thomas has been treating them and giving them a reason to live. This concerns Will because he thinks that his father might be starting a cult, because all the people almost seem like they are worshipping him. Toby then takes him to the lab where they find Thomas tied up to a machine where he dies temporarily. Will looks disgusted by this experiment, and he gets into an argument with Thomas, and Will blames him for the people who are dying. But Thomas reveals that the Afterlife project was started by Will himself, which he quit once they found out the truth. Will leaves feeling very angry and goes out to the beach to get some fresh air. As he gazes out into the distance, he notices Isla, who's putting rocks into a bag. He calls her by name, but she doesn't listen, and then she starts going into the ocean as she's carrying the heavy bag. Will figures she's trying to off herself, and he runs after her. Isla starts sinking into the ocean, but Will swims in and pulls her out. She's very angry and shouts at him as he was supposed to be the last person that she talked to, and she calms down shortly after, and he brings her to the mansion so she can be looked after. Toby's not so keen on talking to a person that's not been vetted, but Thomas approves to interview her. During her interview, Thomas asks her deep philosophical questions and personal questions as well. She argues back on some of the questions, which really impresses him, and he lets her stay in the house. Later that day, Thomas invites selected people, including Will and Isla, for a secret meeting. He makes them do a prayer and then reveals a new machine which he believes can record what dead people see in the afterlife. Everyone is shocked with the discovery and want to see if it actually works, but Will does the calculation and figures out that if a person goes into the machine, it could fry their brain and kill them. So they come up with an idea to find a recently dead person and try the machine on them. So later that night, Toby, Isla, and Will travel to a morgue and steal the body of a recent person who just died, and his name was Pat. They bring his body back to the house, and a bit later, Isla and Will start to have a conversation, and she asks him what his problem is with his father, and he reveals that his mother offed herself the night of their anniversary because Thomas didn't care and didn't want to come to dinner even though he promised. Thomas was always working and neglecting his family, and this led to his wife offing herself because her life felt empty. The next day, the group hook up Pat's body to the machine to finally test it and record the afterlife, but nothing happens. They try multiple times, but Will stops them from frying the guy's brain. And after everyone leaves, Will enters the room alone and puts back a piece of the writing he took out of the machine, which then shows a sequence of Pat Phillips driving to a hospital and visiting someone and arguing with a woman there. When Will sees this, he figures the machine is not recording the afterlife but recalling a memory, which is still a big discovery, but not exactly what Thomas thought. Will doesn't tell anyone, and he just unhooks Pat's body from the machine. Later that day, he joins the group for a meeting. Thomas begins the meeting with a music that brings a woman named Lacey on stage and confronts her about telling other people in the house about the failed device. Lacey is nervous and apologizes for telling, but Thomas makes her confess about how he found her and how low in life she was, and then he tells her to immediately leave the house and to never come back. Lacey begs him to stay, but his decision was final. And after this drama, Will confronts Thomas on his rash decision, which then turns into an argument about Will's mother and Will again leaves feeling upset and calls Isla to go with him. He drives Isla to the hospital and shows her the recording of Pat and tells her that he thinks that the device records memory rather than an afterlife. They then break into the hospital and find a file from Pat Phillips' father, who has died in the hospital. Later that day, Isla is watching the recording when she notices that the man in the recording had a different tattoo from the one she saw on Pat earlier, and this just confuses her even more. They then drive to the beach and Will reveals that this is the beach he saw when he died before, and he's still trying to figure out why he saw this beach, but he still doesn't have an answer. Isla then reveals that she had a son and that he died while she was asleep. While comforting each other, they figure out that they need to talk to the other woman in the recording, and they travel to her house and they learn that the woman is Pat's sister. They tell her that they're from the morgue and wanted info about the day he visited the hospital, but she tells them that Pat left her alone after their dying father and that he never visited him in the hospital. Isla and Will drive back to the house to tell their findings, and just before they leave, they end up kissing, and their kiss was interrupted by Toby. Toby tells them that Thomas has hooked himself up to the machine, and they rush into the lab and Will adjusts the monitor so they're able to see what's going on. The monitor starts playing and they observe that he's seeing the night that his wife offed herself, except this time, Thomas stops her by coming to dinner and celebrating their anniversary. They bring back Thomas from the brink of death, and after connecting what they learned about Pat with Tom's recording, they conclude that the afterlife is an alternate version of their existing life, only with different choices made, where you get a second chance on your most regrettable action. So for Pat, it was visiting his father before he died, and for Thomas, it was saving his wife. They then agree to destroy the machine, as this revelation would provoke millions of people to off themselves because everyone will want to improve the life that they've had before, and Thomas prepares to hold a speech to the whole group, but it gets interrupted by Lacey, who holds a gun and shoots Isla. Isla is fatally shot and then dies in Will's arms. He's devastated, and he stays isolated for days until one day he goes to the lab and hooks himself up to the machine. Thomas and Toby rush into the lab, but he was already in, and Will arrives back on the ferry, where he first met Isla again, and he tries to tell her that she's going to die, but she stops him and tells him that she's part of his memory. She tells him that he has been trying to prevent her death until now, and he's failed from stopping her from offing herself, and she reveals that Will is living in a memory loop trying to prevent Isla's death, and then he restarts on the ferry every time. Will starts to remember the multiple times that he met Isla on the ferry, having the same conversations every time, and then he remembers glimpses of his life before he first learned a woman drowned herself and felt guilty. He tried again and again, but he couldn't stop her from doing it, so he came back to the ferry every time that she died. But Isla then tells him that this time he'd successfully stopped her from drowning herself and that now he could move on to the next life. Everything then goes white as Toby and Thomas try to save him, but they're unsuccessful and Will dies, promising Isla to remember her. In the next scene, we see Will standing on the same beach. As he is walking around, he sees a little boy playing alone and slowly getting into the ocean without realizing it. Will runs to him and gets him out of the water, and the little boy's mother, Isla, who fell asleep for a second and lost the baby, arrives shortly after and thanks Will for getting him back. They don't recognize each other, and after she leaves, he walks away, but as he starts to recall who Isla is, he stops and slowly looks back. And the movie ends here, but there's a post-credit scene that shows Toby playing a guitar in the meeting room with all the seats empty. And this is how this movie comes to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed this recap. Make sure to leave a like, leave a comment, and most of all, subscribe to my channel. I love you all so much, and I promise to see you on my next recap. Bye!